Hello, everyone. My name is Jenna Lawrence, and today I will be talking about everyone's favorite topic in the tech field, documentation. Before we get started, I will share a little bit about myself and my background up until today. Like I said, and Ian, who introduced me, my name is Jenna Lawrence, and I'm based in Denver, Colorado. I have been working in cybersecurity since 2019, and I graduated with a BS in cybersecurity from Metropolitan State University of Denver. My previous job was a security operations center, and I was an escalation point for incident response, but now I am with L2 Cyber Solutions as a security engineer and consultant for government contract, where I mostly take care of GRC documentation activities. I also am part of Women in Cybersecurity organization, and I'm currently serving as the president. We have over 100 members in our Discord server, and we plan the virtual meetups and events like I mentioned earlier. So if you want to check it out, I definitely encourage you to. Everyone is welcome, and it's always free. In my free time, I like to play video games. I do craft fairs for hand embroidery, sewing, and sometimes other crafts. And I also recently got a couple of pet rats pictured here that I love to play with them and take care of them. They're actually really smart. Today, my talk will go over what documentation is, my experiences with documentation and all the problems that came along with it, why documentation is needed, how to write documentation with an adaptable checklist to you, how to maintain documentation, then we'll end with a few minutes for Q&A. Now, I'm sure we all have experience with documentation in some form or fashion, whether you've used it to train when you first start a new job, used it to find answers, or if you've even tried to write it to describe a process while staring at a blank template, thinking to yourself, wow, I really, really hate this. But what actually is documentation? The official definition I could find online is everything related to the protection of an organization's information and property. But to me, it's so much more than that, and it's also not a lot of things. Documentation is not going to be sticky notes or emails or Slack messages you send to your coworkers. It's also not in hard to find places, and it's definitely not a one and done thing. You can't write something in 2005 and never touch it again. Just think about how many people and technologies have changed in your organization since then. Now, documentation is things like playbooks, network maps, and system information. It can be reports like penetration test reports, vulnerability scan results, and incident reports. And most importantly, documentation is always stored somewhere that those who need it can access it. If it's not easily accessible, it will not be helpful. At my previous company, I took over most of the day-to-day work of the documentation for the team. Now, I know a lot of you will call me crazy for this, but it's something I am truly passionate about. And in a bit, I'm going to talk about how bad of an idea it is for one person to take on all the documentation like this. But for now, I'll tell you the story of how our SOC worked. When I started at this company, it was my first real security job out of college. I started working overnight, mainly dealing with tickets in the SOC. And when I started, what I didn't have was a good library of updated documentation. I definitely had plenty of documentation to go through, and much of it was more than a few years old without updates. When I would browse through it and talk to other coworkers, many of them didn't even know it still existed, or they would tell me the process had changed since then. That was frustrating. How was I supposed to learn the ins and outs of the tickets if the processes I was reading about weren't even right anymore? I had to learn from coworkers, explaining how things were done today. That impacts both of us. They had to take the time to explain it to me. I had to understand, take notes, ask clarifying questions repeatedly, annoying them. Now, I know there's a learning curve when you're starting a new job. I'm not complaining about the fact I had to be trained, but I think many of the training sessions I had with coworkers could have been minimized if the documentation was kept up with when I started. There would be more documentation for me to go through. I could have been caught up to speed much quicker. After a while working the overnight shift, I finally transitioned to day shift. Around the same time, a few people were leaving the company. They were previously tasked with starting and maintaining a documentation system, mostly in the form of policies, how to use things, and playbooks for working tickets. This was a big task, and it started slowly after I started working at the company, so it wasn't helpful for my training, like I said. But I showed interest in helping develop the documentation previously, and now that everybody had left, I was the one taking over the massive project to continue updating, maintaining, and writing it. I didn't even really know what that entailed, but I did my best with it. And along the way, I came up with a few ideas on how to make it better before I moved on to a new organization. For a while, I kept with the old system. We had used Word document templates to consolidate all the documentation. They were organized into folders on the shared network drive, and there was no good guide on writing the documentation. All I had to reference were old documents that were already written, some of them multiple years old. There were quite a few problems with this system. For one, and arguably the biggest issue, it wasn't searchable. There was no place I could go to type in a keyword to pull up all the documents about that keyword. Instead, I had to sort through the documents based on the title alone, and that took so much time to get things done. Another thing that was very frustrating is that it took a long time to pull up documents. After working like this for a while, it would get annoying when I had to open many Word documents just to find the one I was looking for. These two aspects combined would be super frustrating, not just for me, but for coworkers as well. I even asked some of my other coworkers what their biggest issues were with the current system. Many of them said one of these two things. They also continued to say they wished they could edit it or add a comment on it, but they still wanted to see the version history so it can be reverted later. None of them wanted to edit the Word document and accidentally mess it up somewhere along the way. Very intimidating to try to edit a Word document. And another piece of feedback I got was that people wanted it to be easily hyperlinked between different pieces of documentation, as well as different tools and technologies that were in use. To help with this issue, and with the support of my management, I wanted to come up with a better system. I wanted the documentation to be searchable. I wanted it to be quick. I wanted it to only be accessible to those who need it. I wanted it to be able to hyperlink to other resources and related documentation. And I wanted it to allow for edits and comments with access to version history. Well, the company already had something that basically checked all these boxes in the form of like a web-based corporate wiki, think something like Confluence. And we weren't already using it for documentation on my team at this point. So I pushed for all the documentation to be moved there because that's the first step. It took about a month and I uploaded most of it myself, hoping that this would be more helpful for everyone. But my boss still wanted to follow our loose Operations 101 templates, where each document would fall into one of the following categories: policy, procedure, and work instructions. I thought it would be a good idea to have specific titles of the tickets and security detections linked in the documentation too. So I added the category detections. Therefore, we came up with 4 categories for documentation templates. For our team, policies were things like the on-call policy, the forensic initiation policy, and basic shift expectations. Procedures were mostly written to explain how to use different security tools and general overviews on how to work most types of tickets, but we didn't go very in depth with that. And work instructions, the most granular, explain how to work specific tickets or use tools to work specific tickets, and step-by-step instructions on how to do specific processes like sending out a shift report. Finally, the detections category would give an overview on specific security detections in our SIEM or cloud environment and even EDR, and what a specific ticket could be referring to. I would link these with the relevant procedures and work instructions to allow someone to see the documentation of everything related to these detections. This helped me categorize all of our documentation. I used these categories on the documentation landing page, which served as a central hub to find all of the documentation we developed. For example, I've made a similar looking documentation page here that I did for the SOC for the purpose of this presentation. This landing page would show up on the corporate-based wiki, like I mentioned earlier. This one has all the documentation listed, and they're easily linked to be able to find them. And I will note that this landing page was only accessible to those people on our team, so nobody else in the company could see this except for page admins. The policies are the standards, and they won't contain much how-to. They mostly focus on what the company policy is. The procedures are linked next, such as a general overview on approaching tickets with external authentication errors, and another procedure on a general overview to use the Splunk environment. The work instructions list the in-depth how-tos, such as how to create and send a shift report, and a specific ticket with the title Suspicious Command issued on Cisco device from external source. As you can see, that title is also the title for the detection. The idea is that these two pieces would be linked. The detection piece would be the raw Splunk query, and the work instructions would tell someone how to work that ticket when it came up. Now, I know these categories and this example are very specific to the SOC that I worked in, but the idea of developing categories like this in general might be able to help you in your role when you go back and review the documentation at your organization. I had this plan set up before I left the company, so I'm not sure if it's still in use today, but I feel I left everything off at the very best spot I could so that it allowed for collaboration, accessibility, easy to find and search, and easy maintenance. So why the need for updating the documentation at any level? Good documentation can be used as a guidebook for all new hires. It accelerates training. It'll get people up to speed faster than traditional training methods. Even if people aren't even training anymore, they still may need to use documentation as an on-the-job reference if they come across something that they don't work with every day. Especially when in a SOC with hundreds of detections, I never memorized every single ticket name, and documentation was especially helpful for working these types of tickets that I rarely came across. Documentation can also determine any gaps within the team or company. It really helps outlining your assets, and from there you can see if anything is missing. Creating and maintaining documentation is a delicate balance. We don't want too little documentation to not be able to thoroughly explain the tasks that need to get done or the important policies, but too much documentation is going to overwhelm people. And let's be honest, not everyone wants to sit and read through hours on hours of documents every day. So we have to figure out how to write good documentation based on these ideas, but not overdo it. These questions will start to help you develop a good system that'll work for your company. And then in a bit, we'll go over a checklist on writing specific documentation itself. First, you want to define your needs or expectations for your company or your team's documentation plan. What generally needs to be documented? Is there anything required for you to document? Next, you'll want to outline specific assets to cover to fit these needs that were defined. Do you need to define all tickets in your SOC and have a document for each one? If so, list out what each ticket is. Do you need to develop documentation for every penetration test you've completed, or do you need to have a document for every incident worked? This is the spot that you list these things out. This is not going to be exhaustive, but it can give you a really good idea on how big of a task this might be. Next, you'll want to think about the day-to-day job for every role that would benefit from this documentation. How will people use this for their specific position? Does it apply to everyone, or is it just the one specific role? And finally, you need to find people to help develop it. Those who work with the asset directly are the best resource to explain it thoroughly, and it's a good idea to develop some sort of template as well. This will help standardize every document and help people working through it to complete it faster. Part of the checklist I'll go over in a bit helps with this template as well. And this should not just be one or two people taking on all of the documentation for their role. It should be as much of a team effort as possible, divided equally. Now, there may be some strong writers on your team, and those that like to write could volunteer to take on more work. That's great in an ideal setting, and that's much how I liked to work in my previous roles. But I know as tech people, there's not always someone on your team who wants to spend their 40 hours a week writing documentation for the next couple months. Now, this is also not to say a technical writer isn't a good asset, but not all the teams have resources to devote one role specifically to documentation or technical writing. But if there is truly a role on your team for technical writer or documentation expert, I still encourage them to collaborate with the members of the team who actually work with the content of the documentation. Because of my experience in the SOC, I ensured there was a checklist when developing new documentation and editing old documentation up to standard. I helped come up with some of these items to ensure I wasn't making redundant documentation and to make sure everything was covered that needed to be. This will vary slightly depending on what your team needs, but ultimately ask yourself some of these questions when reviewing your team or company's documentation. When I helped develop these, I used them on every template as a built-in for every documentation piece that was developed. The first thing to outline is who the audience is for the document. You'll want to keep the audience in mind so it can be written for the appropriate crowd. The next thing is the purpose of the document. Each document should have a purpose. For example, the purpose of this document is to teach people how to work this specific ticket with that specific tool. The next thing is the category the documentation falls into, based on the 4 ones I mentioned earlier, but your organization may just have a different set of categories. Just do what works best for your team. The next one asks about related documentation that's already created that can tie into this piece. Under that, I've also put another question asking if the content of this document is already covered by the related documentation. If most of it or all of it is already covered, or there's a lot of overlap, there may not need to be a second one created, especially if the information can be compiled into one document. But use your best judgment for this. One example I have is when I was developing documentation for an EDR tool we used, I had a procedure that gave a general overview on navigating the EDR, and then another work instruction for using the specific search functionality within the EDR because it had its own specific syntax and caveats that I wanted to make sure to go in depth with for the team. I didn't want them to use the tools documentation as often. I really just did commonly used things for our environment itself. The next question is how this document is going to benefit the audience. If it's not going to benefit the audience, that might be something to get a second opinion on. And finally, the last question asks who is responsible for updating and maintaining this document. It could be something as simple as the SOC or listing out a few specific positions. It should be included though, because if no one is outlined as responsible, it might go a few years without actually being updated. I did develop a little example of the checklist answers. Again, this is very helpful to include on each piece of documentation for the start of the template. I wanted to run through it with the title of the ticket we saw earlier, entitled Suspicious Command Issued on Cisco Device from External Source. The audience for this one is Tier 1 security engineers in the SOC. The purpose of this document is to teach engineers how to work a ticket with the title of the document. This document falls into the work instruction category. The related documentation to this one is the detection with the same title that shows the raw Splunk query. The documentation benefits the audience by teaching them how to work this specific ticket if it comes up in their ticket queue. And finally, the SOC is responsible for maintaining the documentation. It's really as simple as that. After you have done this, you can start writing the bulk of the content for this document. I have a few tips for the content itself, but most of the writing part relies on your specific team. When you're developing the documentation, always keep the audience in mind. You just want to make sure you're writing it geared towards them. Make sure the first mention of any abbreviations or acronyms are explained, even if it seems like common knowledge. Spelling it out literally will help others not be confused, especially because in this field, we all really love reusing acronyms for multiple things. When writing the documentation itself, use bullet points or short paragraphs, or even steps that are numbered. Don't present your reader with a wall of text. Nobody wants to read that. Our brains tend to skip around and skim things anyway. Shorter, concise language and spacing will make it really easy to ingest a lot of information just from a psychology perspective. And finally, have someone review it when you're done. Have them try to recreate the process, make sure they understand the how-to, make sure grammar and spelling seems mostly accurate. It helps to have someone there to review things, especially if it's one person who is working on it, because when we're working on something for a long time, we tend to miss it. Once everything is said and done, the next step is to maintain all that wonderful documentation you just created. Maintaining documentation should be easier than developing it if you keep up with it. You should definitely update it as you go. If something changes in as little as a week after you write a certain document, don't be afraid to edit the document to be updated. Review the documentation at least once a year, if not more than that. This means all the documentation, make sure processes haven't changed, make any updates while going through it. This ties into the first point, because if you continuously update the documentation throughout the year, you'll definitely have less to worry about at the end of it. And don't be afraid to clean up documents as well. If a tool is no longer in use at your company, don't keep that documentation around that says how to use it. You might need to retain it for company policy, but simply write somewhere in the beginning that this document is no longer in use so people don't waste their time. Documentation is more than just an afterthought. It's more than just something you scramble together for compliance purposes. If it's written right, documentation can be the first line of defense for your company so you and your coworkers are prepared when something inevitably goes wrong and you have something to reference on the fly. It can be a great team effort to really make sure everyone on your team can at least describe the day-to-day processes they do. And finally, documentation is not going away no matter how much you hate it. So embrace it, embrace the process, and I hope that something I said here resonated with you today. Here are the references I used to help me with today's presentation. And with that, thank you. And I'd like to open it up for any questions.
Okay, so first, that was awesome. And I want to say why. Because if those of you listening, there was so much there that if you listen to, like, yeah, of course, go through and make sure your documents are organized, make sure they're searchable, make sure that these things are there. I literally spent years in large corporations. The fact that you go through and say, you're essentially talking about creating a taxonomy, like how do we put these documents in? How do we make them living documents that can be updated? I cannot overstate how important that is. And once we've got this talk up and recorded, I am literally going to be linking people to it to say, watch this. If you're not starting here, you're just setting yourself up for a world of pain, and you're going to go, why isn't any of this written down? Because you need someone, and this term sounds a little off, but what you're talking about is a data custodian. Somebody who goes through and says, this document is irrelevant, this one is relevant, this one's deprecated, and can do that. And people who've used a really good knowledge base might not know that that's happened, but can feel it. So, I mean, just excellent. You did have a couple questions. So you covered a lot. So Anonymous here, I would love any tips on how you organize your operations documents, metadata tagging suggestions. Now, I know you covered some of that, but I might have missed. Did you cover anything about metadata? And do you have anything else you want to add?
I didn't. And when I was doing this for this talk, it was very hard for me as a single person to develop all of it. So I don't think we did anything with metadata. We basically had our tickets, like I explained, our tools, our policies, and our detections. And that was kind of where I left it off. But I don't think on the corporate wiki we had tagging, but we might have. I just might have missed it. But that would be a good idea if there was some sort of tagging that could easily just auto tie things in together.
Nice. A couple people kind of asked a similar question, so for sake of time, I'm gonna compress it. They were all around like, what's your favorite tool, essentially? Whether it be creating playbooks or whether it be just organizing the documentation into something. What would you suggest people use based on your preferences?
Well, so I really only have experience with the one. It was Confluence, which we
Okay.
used. So I just kind of went through and created pages and sub pages from that.
Mhm.
But I would love to look into more tools and see comparable things to that. But right now, trying to get my government clearance and
Mm,
doing all that, I don't even know what some of the stuff they use is for that is.
right. Yeah, and it might be even internal, been
hmm
around since George Washington did the first post in the knowledge base. So we talked about tagging, we talked about that. Does your company or have you worked with a technical writer before? And do you think this is Muhammad asking this question? Do you think that's valuable? Do you think you need a technical writer to do some of these?
I think a technical writer is a great asset if you can get one. I know a lot of teams probably cannot get one. I have never worked with one before. I know I've wanted to be one in the past, but I know that that could be a great person to bounce ideas off of. When I was kind of acting as a technical writer role in my SOC, I would definitely go talk to the people on my team who had the most knowledge of the tool, get all the notes from them, and then as I'm developing the documentation, I would try to talk to them about it. So if you
Mhm.
have a technical writer role, make sure you're talking to the people who actually use the stuff.